The Ant-Man and the Microbe Lady. They deal with life, its creation, its existence, its extinction. Edward Wilson and Lynn Margulis, this time on Science Without Walls. What is life? We think we know it when we see it, but here's a little surprise. Remember von Leeuwenhoek, the guy who developed the microscope? Here's an experiment that von Leeuwenhoek accidentally did. These little pieces of earth appear to be completely inanimate. Looking at them under the microscope, we don't see much. No life, nothing moves. These little dry specks can exist like this for years, even decades. Specks similar to them are found in many parts of Utah, on the sandstone, in the desert, on rocks, in the gullies and stream channels throughout the Southwest. They are dry, appear to be lifeless, and yet when the rain comes, a pool forms and there is life-giving water. Perhaps for only a few minutes, maybe for just a few hours. These lifeless specks were given water about an hour ago. Life has appeared. These are animals. They have resurrected, come back to life. Their remarkable resurrection is not unique. There are also plants which can completely dry out and years later, with the addition of a little water, come back to life. They are called resurrection plants. There are many other organisms which can survive almost complete drying and come back to life when the water returns. These particular little creatures are called tardigrades. Here's how they look up very close. They are related to the so-called cryptobiotic soil, which are told not to walk on, not to disturb, throughout the desert lands of Utah and Arizona. These tardigrades are a wonderful example of life's way of dealing with difficult environments, part of the incredible diversity of life. Today we'll cover two key points. One, the diversity of living things, biodiversity. And point two, how and why this incredible biodiversity is rapidly shrinking, why life forms are becoming extinct. We won't use standard textbooks. We'll use several beautiful, well-written, and extremely important contemporary books, written not for scientists, but for you and me, the general public. Lynn Margulis is a biologist who has helped interpret and organize biology. There are many ways to organize, to categorize the diversity of life. One way, largely as a result of her efforts, is the 5 Kingdoms model. You've already seen her beautiful poster. Her little paperback book of the same name goes into more detail. The metaphorical hand represents the 5 kingdoms present on Earth today and illustrates their approximate origins in time. The thumb represents the earliest kingdom, which includes all of the many kinds of bacteria. This is the mother kingdom, Kingdom Monera. Single cells which do not have nuclei, called prokaryotes, the most primitive life forms. The fingers are all similar in the sense that they represent cells with nuclei, eukaryotes. The index finger represents animals, the next finger represents plants, and still the next represents fungi. And finally, the little finger represents those small, mainly single-celled creatures, the protists. Protists and bacteria are both single-celled organisms, but they are fundamentally different because the bacteria have no nucleus, while the protists certainly do. The back of the hand and the small finger are continuous, showing that all of the multicellular kingdoms involving nucleus-containing cells originated from the protists, our single-cell ancestors. The thumb is continuous with the base of the hand, illustrating that all cells trace their cellular genealogy back nearly 4 billion years to those first ancestral prokaryotes. The poster shows this metaphorical hand gently holding our little blue planet in a universe of stars. Physicists have their basic rules, their basic laws of the universe. Chemists have their periodic table, the 92 natural elements, plus a dozen or so man-made ones. Biologists have their 5 kingdoms, their 5 major groupings, and within them over 100 phyla. When we considered the periodic table, we used Peter Atkins' little book, The Periodic Kingdom. We flew over the 92 elements and their landscape, or rather their chemical scape. We got some general feeling and appreciation for their properties and characteristics. Well, that's what Lynn Margulis and her co-author, Carlene Schwartz, do in this little book, an illustrated guide to the phyla of life on Earth. As you get motivated and interested to learn more about biology, you'll probably get to know and love 5 kingdoms, and Lynn Margulis's recent book, What is Life? Although we generally think of life as being either plant or animal, they are only 2 of the 5 basic kingdoms of life. The fungi are not plants and they are not animals. They are separate, different. They have their own kingdom, their own classification. Fungi have a unique role and niche in recycling. They turn over dead matter, organic matter in our biosphere. They permit complete recycling of nearly all matter on the planet, including many inorganic minerals. We cannot see the 2 most primitive kingdoms without microscopes. The protists are single-celled organisms who, together with animals, plants, and fungi, all have complex cells with nuclei in which much of their genetic and reproductive machinery is housed. Many protists are photosynthetic, but that doesn't make them plants, and many protists eat other protists. They are predatory, but that doesn't make them animals. Protists and other creatures in the kingdom Protostista are distinct. They are different, and they are very old. Even older are the bacteria, the kingdom Monera, which includes the oldest and most primitive life forms on Earth, whose single cell does not have a nucleus. Their genetic and reproductive machinery is distributed throughout the entire cell. There are probably millions of species of bacteria. From man's perspective, some are good and some are bad. Our entire biosphere, all of life on Earth, is completely dependent on bacteria. We cannot grow food without them. We cannot raise animals without them. We cannot even operate our gastrointestinal tracts without them. All life on Earth, with the possible exception of a few bacteria, involves complex symbioses, cooperative interactions between life forms spanning the 5 basic kingdoms. Fungi in the roots of plants allow them to fix nitrogen. Bacteria in your gut allow you to digest. Bacteria in the guts of cattle allow them to digest. Lichens, which are important in breaking down rocks and minerals into soluble components, are symbiotic associations of fungi and photosynthetic cells, certain bacteria or protists. We largely ignore what we cannot see. We are usually unaware of the protists and the bacteria. When we do recognize them, it's often because of some negative trait or characteristic, such as the infections caused by some bacteria. But without the bacteria, we and most other life forms simply could not exist. Let's now appreciate the enormous diversity of life, not from the perspective of our primitive biologists in the wild, but from the perspective of Edward Wilson of Harvard University. He is best known in the biology community for his extensive studies of ants. But Wilson's eyes and his biological skills encompass far more than ants. His book, The Diversity of Life, will now be our guide. Life is confined to a very thin band on the surface of the planet, extending to the top of the highest mountains and down to the deepest depths of the ocean. This 50,000 or so foot shell, less than 10 miles thick, is almost infinitesimally thin on the scale of the Earth. If we were to scale the Earth down nearly 1,000,000 times to the size of a ping pong ball, the Earth's surface would be far smoother than the smoothest ping pong ball you could find. But within that thin band is an enormous diversity of life forms, perhaps 30 million species. A species is a group of creatures which can breed, can reproduce under natural conditions, thus propagating the species. Organisms change in response to changes in their environment and living conditions. When a group of the species has been separated for a long time and gone through many generations and chooses not to breed with others outside the immediate group, then diversity has increased and that group is now an independent, a different species. Diversity in one group of species may encourage diversities in other groups. A good example is insects and flowers. There's an immense diversity of both kinds. These two groups are, in Wilson's words, united by intricate symbioses. Species can be created quickly and diversity can expand explosively, sometimes only requiring a few generations. And species can die completely, become extinct very rapidly. Biology's incredible biodiversity, its 30 million or so species, has thrilled and confused man and woman. How did it all come to be? How did it evolve? It took the brilliance of Isaac Newton to sort out, explain, organize, and understand much of the physical world, the basic rules of the cosmos. Biology is really far more complex and potentially more confusing. But fortunately, biology now has an incredible unifying principle, the principle of natural selection. Natural selection is often called the survival of the fittest. It was first clearly presented by another genius, Charles Darwin, only 100 or so years ago. Organisms are born, grow and live, give birth to others of their own kind, and die. This goes on for hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of generations, for millions of years. Half of your genetic code and half of your mates guides the development of your offspring. We know that in the wild, the naturally weak do not generally survive. Their line, their genes, die with them. The fact of survival and the fact of early death produces an incredible selection process, a natural sieve or filter. The able, the smart, the strong make it through the sieve. The weak or less able don't. There is a natural selection process. That is Darwin's great idea. You know that the code of life, the instructions for development, are in your genes, in your DNA. And although DNA has an incredibly good replication or copying process, mistakes do occur. Such a mistake is a mutation. Mutations can occur due to random statistical errors in copying, and mutations can occur due to environmental influences, certain chemicals or radiation, for example. If your private mutation is in the half of your genes, the DNA, passed on to your offspring, then it may affect how that son or daughter develops. Most mutations are not beneficial, so natural selection helps screen or sieve them out. But a very few mutations could be beneficial. If that benefit is sufficient to enhance survival, then that mutated DNA is replicated and passed on through many generations, improving the species. Natural selection is an incredible but extremely slow filter. Mutations which tend to decrease survival are selected out, and mutations which enhance survival are selected in. The result is that the species, generally and statistically, slowly improves, incrementally, one statistical step at a time. Each tiny step selected for or against by natural selection. Mutations are statistical throws of the DNA dice, but the dice are loaded by natural selection. But changes can also occur in much larger jumps which are also filtered and sieved by natural selection. And this is where our friend Lynn Margulis comes in. The Margulis model is now called symbiogenesis. A very large jump in properties or characteristics will develop if two very different organisms come together, literally fusing to become one new organism, very different from its components. The new whole is very different than its component parts. If the new symbiotic organism has enhanced characteristics, then it will do well. Natural selection will favor it, and a new species has evolved. So there appear to be two processes by which species evolve. One is incremental, statistical, and slow, trial and error process, mutations which play themselves out in many future generations, acted upon by Darwin's natural selection. The other is a process of internal symbiosis, now called symbiogenesis. And of course, both processes are underway all the time. Lynn Margulis and others argued forcefully for many years that the major energetic machinery in your cells and mine, the mitochondria, traced their origins to bacteria that were encapsulated or somehow injected themselves into our ancestral cells, providing those ancestral cells with incredibly new capabilities and characteristics. If a very major dramatic change occurs, like the sudden appearance of mitochondrial structures in cells that previously didn't have them, then there is an enormous jump in the capabilities and properties of that organism. It can now compete very differently, perhaps much more effectively, in the natural environment. So things happen slowly, incrementally, and things happen quickly, dramatically, with a sudden jump in capability. And from this new plateau, this new level, many new things are possible. It's called a paradigm shift. That's what Galileo did. That's what Newton did with gravity and with forces at a distance. That's what Darwin did with natural selection. And that's what Lynn Margulis did with intracellular symbiosis. Such seminal ideas are generally viewed very negatively by the scientific community because the new synthesis, the new view, is so radically different from the old one that the first reaction is that it is science fantasy. It may take years, decades, even centuries before the general scientific community eventually appreciates the new view as appropriate and useful. If the new ideas do prove to be correct, with time they do win support and eventually even find themselves in textbooks. Lynn Margulis was a scientific heretic, and now she is a guru, and her symbiosis model is now in almost every basic biology textbook. Her paradigm shift has led to an entirely new plateau. We have begun to recognize that we really know very little about the life forms on our planet. Wilson says that we dwell on a largely unexplored planet. We're only now beginning to appreciate the diversity of species in the deep ocean, the diversity of species in the rainforests, and even the diversity of species in our own backyards. There are roughly 5,000 different tiny species in just 1 gram of forest soil. And most of those species are unclassified, unstudied, and largely unknown. Wilson calls species classification the black hole of taxonomy. Taxonomy means the process by which biologists name, categorize, classify, and differentiate species, like Linnaeus did. Life has been developing and evolving on our planet for over 4 billion years, almost since the planet formed. The universe was created roughly 15 billion years ago in the Big Bang. At least that's the most accepted model today. Earth coalesced nearly 5 billion years ago. We'll see in our next program that primitive life forms actually developed fairly rapidly, probably 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. For the first 2+ billion years, life was mainly bacteria. Most of the life forms that you and I relate to on a daily basis and that we think of when we think of the diversity of life began to originate less than 1 billion years ago in what is now called the Cambrian explosion. Although most of the species that existed back then are now extinct, the species derived and evolved from them are our fellow inhabitants of the planet. More different species are alive today than at any other time in the past because there's been a general tendency for diversity to increase. That is, until man started to fully dominate and take over the planet. Biologists and ecologists are now finding very rapid decreases in the number of species, largely due to the presence of man and the great decrease in the available habitat for these species. Wilson's schematic figure illustrates the point. Man, with his superior hunting and intellectual skills and his ability to expand his population at a very rapid rate, means the demise of big animals. This is, of course, happening in Africa, has happened extensively in Australia and North America, and is also happening in other parts of the world. There are now many species which exist only in very small areas of the planet, and which, when gone, will be gone forever. Extinction hotspots exist on every continent. As one species becomes threatened, all the other species which interact with it and are partially dependent on it are also threatened. The bumper sticker that says extinction is forever is correct. Jurassic Park and the rebirth of the dinosaurs is science fiction. There were 5 great extinction events in the history of life on Earth over the last 500 million or so years, prior to the arrival of man. These mass extinction events were probably due to major cataclysms that adversely affected the global environment. For at least one of the mass extinction events in the past, some scientists have hypothesized that the crashing of a large meteorite may have caused major changes in global weather patterns and climate. Immense geological disturbances, such as massive tectonic and volcanic activity, also may have contributed to the global environmental changes that underlay most mass extinction events. These are statistical, unpredictable events, perhaps 5 of them over the last 500 or so million years. We can ask, after each downturn, how did biodiversity recover? How long did it take for evolution to restore the diversity after these major extinction episodes? The answer is roughly 5 million years are required to regain biodiversity. There is no way using conventional, slow, Darwinian evolutionary processes to rapidly restore biodiversity once it is gone. Very roughly, an individual species tends to exist for about 1 million years. It's slowly replaced by other, more successful and more adaptable species. That means that out of 1 million species, about 1 goes extinct every year. Wilson defines that as the background extinction rate. We saw last time that there is a pyramid to life forms, the large animals being relatively rare and requiring a very large land area for their sustenance, smaller animals being more common, and even smaller ones, such as field mice, more common, and so forth. The pyramidal structure required for species diversity and for stable ecosystems has been dramatically altered by you and by me and our Homo sapiens cousins, mainly in the last 50 years. Men and women, over 5 billion of us, are now 100 times more numerous than any other land animal of comparable size in the history of the planet. Human activity has increased the extinction rate dramatically. For example, by 1,000 to 10,000 times in the rainforest, due to reduction in land area. Wilson begins his book, The Diversity of Life, and also concludes it by saying that, quote, humanity has initiated the sixth great extinction spasm, rushing to eternity a large fraction of our fellow species in a single generation, unquote. Life requires space, ocean space, river and lake space, and land space. Space that is accessible to water, to light, space that isn't covered in asphalt or concrete and isn't permeated with herbicides or pesticides. Utah has always had a lot of space and a few people. Up until 15 to 20 years ago, we were one of the least populated states in the Union, with a fairly large land area and a rich and diverse geography. But in the last quarter century, Utah's population has increased immensely. We now have growth summits. We now have wilderness debates and controversies. Physics teaches us that there are limits, there are rules, there are constraints. So does chemistry, and now so does biology. Utah can no longer ignore those rules and those constraints. Diversity and extinction, two key concepts in biology which we need to understand, and we must insist that our social and political leaders also understand them. Observe the natural world. Consider its diversity. Think about extinction. Tune in to nature programs. Open your eyes and ears when outside. Roll the windows down in the car. Remove the earplugs of your Walkman or Discman, at least for a short time. Smell the flowers. Listen to the birds. Lie in the grass. Walk among the aspen. There is still an incredible diversity of life out there. Experience, appreciate it, and please protect it. See you next time.
They paved paradise, put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. They took all the trees, put them in a tree museum, and they charged the people $1.50 just to see them. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.